Good morning, Redemption Hill family. It's a different kind of Sunday. It's a micro church Sunday, and we have been moving towards having our micro churches really create their own Sunday gathering experience. We're giving some tools and opportunities, but we want to make sure everybody watches this video. So if you know somebody who hasn't, please do, because we really have some important things that are happening in our community. Primarily, we want to make sure everybody who's able to is there on June 6th for our family gathering at 5:30 p.m. at the Boise Friends Church in their Fellowship Hall. We want to share with you a little bit about the future, and I'm just going to preview a little bit of it today, and we'll dive into more of the details here in a week. So a week from today, we want you to dive in. I think a lot about this question. I don't know if you do, but I do. I think a lot about this question. Why do we exist? Why do we do what is Redemption Hill? What causes us to kind of dive in? And here's the answers that I come back to time and time again. The first is we exist because the oikos, the household of faith that is the local community, is the building blocks of God's family. Just like a couple is the building blocks of any extended family and the children that come from it and the families that they're connected to, the oikos, the family of God that happens in a place, a local family of people, an extended spiritual family, that's the basic building blocks of God's family. We see this all throughout the Bible, where households are counted, where households are the center. And in the first century, they would have said the word oikos, which means household. And in the Roman context, the household was an extended family that was centered around a primary family or a nuclear family that had extended family connections. So one of those was like Zacchaeus. In Luke chapter 19, you see when Jesus reached the spot, he said he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to talk. He said he's going to be the guest of a sinner, because Zacchaeus was a tax collector. But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Lord, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anyone out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." And Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this oikos, this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham." Now what happens here is you see that because Zacchaeus chooses to fall in the way of Jesus and welcomes Jesus into the hospitality of his house, his whole family is saved. We see that time and time again, that salvation enters through one person, but then you see the gospel work its way like leaven through an entire family, through an entire neighborhood, through an entire community. In Acts, we see it again. We see it with the story of Lydia. On the Sabbath, Acts chapter 16, we went outside the gate to the river where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the woman who had gathered there. One there was listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message, and when she and the members of her oikos, her household, were baptized, she invited us into her home, her oikos, and she said, "If you consider me a believer in the Lord, come and stay at my house." And she persuaded us. So Lydia is this business lady, and she's out in this place outside of Thyatira that's a holy place that they gather for prayer, probably a Jewish community. They probably didn't have a synagogue because they didn't have the requisite 7 males who had been circumcised, who could be the elders of that community. But while they were there, Lydia, this woman, receives the grace of God. She's a worshiper of God, and her heart's open to respond to the gospel, Paul's message. And then she and the members of her household, which was probably like a guild, like a community that worked together in a small company, and she bought and sold the purple cloth, which was this royal, luxurious color. So she was a fashion maven in the first century, and her whole household was turned upside down. We believe that the oikos, that household, is not just the basic element of what it means to be God's people, but it's also the basic element of how God wants to work through mission in the world. So the mission of the household of God then We have to understand what that is if we want to do what God's called us to do. Our mission as the house of God is to help people walk with God by following Jesus and being a blessing to the world around us. So as the household of God, that oikos, the extended spiritual family, we live sent with this work of sharing the good news of both what Jesus did and then also being the good news, like literally being servants, ones who care for and bring good news with us wherever we go. And so how do we do that? Well, as missionaries, we look around and we ask the question, well, what is good news to the community around us? And then what missionaries do is they take the gospel and they contextualize it so it sounds like good news where they are. So if you're in a place with a lot of thirsty people, a lot of people who don't have access to clean water, the good news doesn't sound like a bunch of words and messages and books. The good news sounds like water, literal water, gushing from the ground to provide for a community. And so Jesus people, when the good news looks a lot like water, they find a way to bring water to thirsty people. When the gospel looks, for sick people, the gospel looks like healing and presence. That's good news. When you're sick, you want someone to be with you and you want healing. And so for Jesus people, they bring healing and they bring the presence, the embodiment of God's presence with them where they go. And to the lonely, the good news looks a lot like a place to belong. It's like a salve. It's like a medicinal ointment for the soul. When you're lonely, you need a place to belong. And we live in a world filled with lonely people. And with a world filled with lonely people, good news sounds a lot like hospitality, like a place for them to belong, an open table that they can enter into, an open invite to your home, an open schedule where you have room for them, an open door to stop in and share life together, a space where they can belong and be comfortable, where they can experience community. In 2000, Robert Putnam, who's this incredible sociologist, wrote this book called Bowling Alone, and it's about the fraying of the ties, the social structures and ties of American culture. What he talks about is that in the mid-20th century, there was all of these loose ties that were connected to the building of communities around recreation, around worship, and around service. And there was these fraternal orders of service, and there's churches who provided worship and connection, and there was these recreational places where people spent their lives, third spaces outside of work and home. And once we stopped bowling together, the bowling leagues all died. Now, for a minute, we were trying to do Wii bowling online or in person, but then we stopped even pretending somewhere along the way that the digital spaces could provide the meaningful shared lives that our souls craved, and we just gave in to the feeling of loneliness and isolation. We have almost none of these loose ties or social structures of communities that are so vital. They've all been severed. Basically, we live very tightly held lives. In the ancient world, they had the town square, the steps of the temple, or the marketplace where people could interact, be seen, do business together. And throughout all of human history, there's been places, real places in the real world where they're not at work and they're not at home, but a third space to share their lives in community. And those spaces, the few that we had left, were decimated by COVID. All of a sudden, the third space was only digitally mediated space that didn't really have the sort of interaction and care and being seen that we needed. Malls are closing. Vacancies are high. Here in Boise, our capital city market was obliterated over the last 18 months. Coffee shops were closed. And that last vestige, the shopping mall, the place where we went for a little bit of human interaction, they moved almost from a lot online to completely online. So no more tellers and no more cashiers and no more relationships, just transactions mediated by our phones and our apps. But we've seen that this kind of isolation that this sort of being alone in the world and only being mediated by digital spaces, it's destroying us. Anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, they're all at all-time highs. And this is so clearly tied to our deep need for community. And I think that churches used to provide that kind of community, at least for a percentage of the world. There were these connections and loose relationships and in oikos and extended spiritual families and churches. But for the most part, churches have turned into like a 1 hour affair with a building on Sundays lying empty 6 days a week. Those ties that we did have through church have fallen into a shared consumption of a worship experience. But what we saw in COVID is that hour of content is not enough to sustain our souls. I've been a part of many, many churches, dedicated holy places that cost tens of millions of dollars. And crazy enough, they're built a lot like stadiums for sports. They're just there to house a bunch of people 1 day a week. But what if there were other ways to gather, other ways to set aside space for what we're trying to do as a community, as the extended family of God in a city? I've been praying since we started this community that God would provide a new thing among us, a path forward that worked with God's Spirit, not against it. We think, me and the elders and the leaders of our church, we think that church spaces can be an answer to the ache of our community for connection that they don't know that they need. It doesn't have to be an open door just 1 day a week. And so the elders, myself and Bob, we've been kicking around an idea for a third space. Not work and not home, but open space for the community to gather like a community living room. A space to do life together. And we know that people like post-COVID are going to need places to work out of their homes. Like we think that that's a necessary thing. We think that people are going to need places to gather with their friends, places to gather around the table, places to be cared for and known, a place to feel at home. And we think that we have a way that we can leverage our gathering space to bless our community in unexpected ways. That's available all 7 days a week, both as a cafe and a co-working space, but also as a place where God's people open up their doors for the community. So we want to share with you during our meeting next Sunday night a concept to rent a building that's here on the West Bench, that's close to our current location, and has lots of space that we could create a sort of living room for the neighborhood to gather all week that blesses the whole community. We put together a proposal with a plan that we want to share with you on June 6th, next Sunday night at our family meeting. And really, like, this is just a time for us to discern. We're going to bring a proposal. We're going to share with you what we've been thinking. And then we're going to just pray that God would speak. God would share with us what we need to do and what to do in this next season. It's a time for discernment as a family on what's next for us as a community. And we're so, let me finish by saying this. We're so deeply thankful for our partnership that will continue with Boise Friends, even if we do move on to a new space. We'll continue to have Wonder School in their building. We'll continue to have indoor park. We'll continue to host Launchpad for high school students. But we think that this may be a time for God to launch us into some new uncharted territory. And we'd love for you to spend some time dreaming and praying with your microchurch this week while you're together, praying for inspiration on how God might use this space to reach our neighbors, our friends, our teammates, our coworkers. Pray for wisdom on whether to move forward with a new venture that comes with some complex details and some risk alongside of it. And pray that God shows us what good news is for our community, so that as we are trying to contextualize the good news in that space, that we understand what the needs of the people around us are. And lastly, I want you to challenge you, please pray for your neighbors and friends and how God might use this new season to create opportunities for good news in their lives. So we have a lot to share, and we want to share more. So come and don't miss out on June 6th, 5:30 p.m. at Boise Friends in the Fellowship Hall. We think that it's going to be a sweet time of sharing stories and looking forward and praying together about what God might do in this next season through our community. So thank you for being a part of this time together, and make sure to follow your email and our Facebook group for any updates. Blessings, friends.